Now entering the Bitcoin Podcast Network.
This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the easiest, fastest, and most secure way to swap your digital assets. Don't run the risk of leaving your funds on a centralized exchange. Visit Shapeshift.io to get started today. And this episode is also sponsored by my patrons on Patreon. We got about 40 at about $700 a month, and so I like to give different examples each episode for why they support. And here's why Jason says he supports. He says, I like your philosophy of a humanist blockchain future. It is the only perceived non-faith-based approach that has the ability to create something for the common good. Woo! So today's episode is with Kim-Mai Cutler and Garry, who are partners at Initialized Capital. And it was a in-person interview, and it was also my first two-person interview, which was fun, so you can kind of hear them talk back and forth with each other. And we talk about a bunch of different things, but there are kind of four big buckets. The first is techno-utopianism versus skepticism, and Kim and Garry take different sides on this, and the key concept here is that we have this positive-sum web world versus our kind of zero-sum atom physical world. And so you have this awesome thing where people can talk on the internet, information's flowing freely, stuff seems so awesome, but those infinite electrons really do meet these finite atoms of normal life. And you kind of, SF is a perfect example of that, where you have, venture capital firms and tech offices indoors, and then outdoors a bunch of homeless people staying on the street, whatever. So we talk about that. We also talk about venture capital as a kind of system and what it's optimized for, essentially. And this is something that I personally have harped on a bunch, where, venture capital isn't quite as good at meeting certain needs, like providing value to poor people, because they can pay less. So if you give a poor person value, they can only pay $1 versus a rich person value, and they can pay $100. And so we talked about that and how, and it was honestly a really good conversation, and how they're both very aware of how venture capital, what it's optimized for and what that system is optimized for versus other kind of civic institutions, also how those civic institutions are invested in venture capital, things like that. And for me, I came out of it thinking, what's the design problem? Like, can we design a system like venture capital that has all the goods of it with the growth and the innovation and things like that, but it's also optimized for something like happiness and kind of long-term anti-fragility, taking things like externalities into account, or working from a shared outcome co-evolution perspective. Not sure how to do that, but definitely on my mind, and definitely something we talked about. The third thing we talk about is San Francisco as a place of both beautiful spontaneity. So, for example, I was initially just going to have this interview with Garry, but then Kim was there. And so we were able to have the interview with the three of us. So that's like a beautiful example of the power of San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but also some of the negatives and why people are leaving, primarily around housing and transportation, and how the infrastructure hasn't really kept up with the tech and the innovation. And then finally, we talk about Biddle as a great meme, and how there's one interesting part of it, though, which is that the money's already been transferred. And so the meme, as in if you do an ICO, the money's already gone into your bank account or whatever. And so it's more kind of, the meme is powerful, especially on the reputation and peer pressure side. And this is very aligned with a lot of things we talk about on the show about the abundance of capital, and then moving towards, from the abundance of capital towards the scarcity of things like reputation or attention. And then finally, Garry tries to make shipple happen. Like shipping things, but shipple. So we'll see if that catches on. So with that, hope you enjoyed this episode with both Garry and Kim-Mai. Yeah, it's a good one. Goodbye. Hello everybody, my name is Reese Lindmark, and welcome to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future. And in this episode, we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world. And today we're going to specifically talk about Series A macro systems, where we ask the question, where are we as humanity headed? And today's kind of a fun interview because we're actually live in person. You can hear the sound of coffee and things. And I'm with Garry Tan and Kim-Mai Cutler at their office in San Francisco. And Garry and Kim are partners at Initialized Capital, which was the first seed investor in Coinbase. So thank you all for being here and excited to dive in.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Woohoo! So let's start at kind of this big macro level before we go into more kind of blockchain-y things. And I saw, Garry, that you shared this great Kyrgyzstan and World in Data, Max Roser piece about egotistical altruism. And so could you just this is kind of a macro systems perspective on how we can create a win-win world. Could you say a little bit more about what that video is about and what made you excited by it?
Oh yeah, it's very techno-utopianism, but that's sort of what I really believe in. Is that the video starts off with sort of basically an agrarian society. For most of human history and prehistory, we basically were subsistence farmers, and everything was very zero-sum. And so, throughout history, you think about, wars between city-states or, rivaling tribes. And so, early in the video, it really sort of establishes humanity sort of as very zero-sum, really sort of society breaking down into very codified, almost a caste system in all sorts of ways. And the key part in sort of the main point of the video is actually, when did that really change? Like when did, sort of wealth really spread across all of society? And that was really, technology. So the Industrial Revolution, really greatly increasing production across the board. And then, today we basically get to sit around and talk about ideas over coffee, at least, some of us, and very, a good deal of very lucky middle-class people, certainly in the West, right? And that hasn't spread all the way across the globe yet, but the hope is that does. And so that's really the most positive sum sort of situation that you could have, actually, that what technology lets us do is actually increase production. And so, that's sort of the key to a better utopian future, sort of rising out of basically, extreme need.
Yeah. And like you said, it happened for so long that we lived in this scarcity-driven world, in a kind of a win-lose world. And as society and as humanity, it's kind of like, whoa, wait a second, something has changed here.
Right.
And now we can live in this world closer to abundance, in this win-win world. I love the same guy, Max Roser, has this piece, this 6 graphs piece, where he looks at poverty and child education and vaccination, all these things. And like 200 years ago, 90% of people lived in poverty. 90% of people didn't have education. 90% of people weren't vaccinated. And now everything is flipped, and so we're getting closer to living in this good world. But it's also kind of intense because I feel like we haven't quite changed our mindset around it. Do you guys feel like there's still people who are living in a kind of a scarcity, competitive win-lose world rather than a win-win, abundant world?
I'm more of a techno-skeptic here, I guess. That's like the role that I'm supposed to play.
Good.
I think if you look at the Bay Area in California, there's lots of people who are really, it's very difficult to stay here. It's very difficult to pay for families here. It's very difficult to pay for shelter here. We are straining we're really testing the limits of like the environment, of climate, of the existing infrastructure that we have. And, my perspective is more that I think the private sector has a really important role to test lots of new ideas, to figure out which ones work, and then to scale them to a certain point. But then at a different point, broader public system also has to establish strong balances of power and strong frameworks for that innovation to happen within. Mm-hmm. And so I think they work together.
Yeah. So do you think so? With San Francisco as an example, as you're walking, so I agree that the private things gone unchecked is generally a poor thing. Do you think that, and whose role is it, I guess? Do you think it's the nation state's role, or do you think it is the individuals, venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and what have you, to start, actively self-taxing themselves? Or how do you think we should solve it.
Well, I mean, I think we're all participants in a broader civic society, and we're all playing dual roles or multiple roles as we speak. So, like, you can be a citizen and an active citizen and a participant in a public government, and then you can also be a private actor. You know, you can be an investor, you can be an entrepreneur, you can be, a small business owner, and you're playing those roles at the same time. And so that, like, from one vantage point, if you're a business operator, doing right by your customers, doing right by your employees, and doing right by your investors are all like good things to do, to act as like a person of integrity within the business community. But then as a civic actor, you're also a citizen in society, and that means making sure that public infrastructure and systems have adequate resources to do the things that the private sector is unable to do, and then also paying enough attention such that the systems are making informed, accurate decisions about how to manage both public and private behavior.
Yeah, I love that. I think that the idea around having multiple personas and saying, okay, right now I'm existing in the market, make money, competitive persona, and I will do good to my investors and to my employees and to whatever, that seems good. And then also at the same time being like, that perspective has lots of externalities that aren't being taken account, because you can't, if you take them into account, then your startup's going to fail because you're trying to do too much good or whatever. And so making sure you also have kind of an externality mindset as well that tries to take those into account and bring them together. So I like that. But Garry, you were, at the beginning we were talking about you as maybe the techno-utopian vibe.
So I want to say something. Is being a techno-utopian a contrarian position right now?
It feels like it is.
Totally. Say why that is and why you still hold your views. Yeah.
A lot of it just comes from my personal experience. We grew up basically lower middle class in Fremont in the Bay Area, and this sort of, both of us are Bay Area natives.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's more shocking to me is that the people who are very active in sort of even in our community, they actually don't recognize the role that tech has played in basically making this the most upwardly mobile society in the world.
Yeah.
Just by the numbers, there are more people who have been raised up by the existence of tech in Silicon Valley than anywhere else.
Sub 2 or like a 2%. It's somewhere between 2 and 3, or it's even below 2% unemployment rate right now in the Bay Area.
Wow.
So for friends who move from elsewhere and work in public policy, they're just like, it's just like kind of unheard.
It's great. But now what we're hearing, especially around tech, around local discourse, particularly around housing and basically housing and transit. Like, these are the basic functioning building blocks of society.
Yeah, and that's where it gets it's like the zero sum reality of the physical world and resources meets this more positive sum world that is available on the web, where you have free access to lots of ideas and content and interaction with people and intellectual stimulation. You kind of put those two together, and it's just like
this is literally physically where unlimited positive sum thinking meets zero sum atoms. Exactly. It's like infinite electrons meet very finite atoms right now.
Yes, and those finite atoms, it's kind of because you have the tech companies who are doing incredible things in the infinite, where transaction costs are zero for distributing information, for all the things, and then outside there are homeless people hanging. It's like that it feels strange.
It's ground zero for that battle right now.
That's also, I would also emphasize that the people, like, what you see in this neighborhood in particular is like, this is not an accident. This is like a product of very intentional sets of decisions that were made over the course of several decades. At the federal level, at the state level, what is out there is a collective choice that people in society are tolerating because we don't allocate enough resources, both on the wage side, on low-income social programs, and low-income housing, and like that scaffolding has been just allowed to deteriorate over the last 30 years. Through intentional decision making.
So I agree with all that. And my claim, so I guess the question here then is, what should a venture capitalist do? And my slight claim might be that the system itself has been very good thus far, but it might be moderately broken for what we want to do in the future, because if you're a venture capitalist, you want to provide value to people. You want to support people who provide value, And if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm like, hey, I'm going to provide value to these people. And look, they're rich people. When I provide them 1 unit worth of value, they can give me $100 in return. It's like, ooh, that's a pretty
1,000x.
Or 1,000x, exactly. That's a pretty investable company. But if I try to provide 1 unit of value to like some poor people, it's like, well, they're only going to be able to pay me $1 in return. And you got to make it up with scale or whatever. So I feel like that kind of deep thing where the value function is kind of misallocating where value is actually being created. How do you guys think about that from a venture capital perspective, and trying to do good in the world?
I think that you have to be very clear about what venture capital as a financial tool can and can't do.
Yep.
There are things that it can do, and there are things that it can't do. I mean, at the end of the day, like, if you're a venture capitalist, you raise funds from other investors, many of whom are actually civic actors and public actors, many of whom are, things like foundations and universities and things that support civic society and pension funds.
Yep.
And then they're only investing you on the basis of what the expected sets of financial returns that you're going to provide them, regardless of what you're investing in.
Totally.
You're going to present a thesis, obviously, and then you take that, and then the structure of venture is such that you can only make investments that scale really, large, have the capacity to scale in a really to very large capacities.
Yeah.
And so that inherently forces you in the direction of certain types of businesses and not in the direction of others.
Yeah.
And what happens in that other segment is a point where it either should be a totally different source of capital that's structured differently for a different rate of expected return, or that needs to be supplied by the public sector or philanthropy.
Yep.
And just being very like clear and upfront about that.
Yep, I agree. I think that is or at least that, I agree that's a clear perspective. I think it's similar to your other perspective, which was, hey, let's bucket our minds into two different things and then act in different ways in different things.
Yeah.
Gary, do you agree with that, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, from startup culture, one thing that we know for certain is that every person, every entity, every business, every startup can really only do one thing really, really well.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I would also challenge the other notion that you mentioned, which
yay.
Which is like a lot of times things that are initially for a small subsegment of people who are more affluent. There are many cases over the entire course of recent history in the technology industry and venture capital where that has then enabled, an entrepreneur to do a proof of concept and then later made that product or service progressively more and more accessible to different ranges of incomes of people.
Totally.
To potentially billions of people. So,
and I fully agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that is that's part of the natural need to scale. If you're going to hit all 4 billion smartphone users, a lot of those people have to, and it's part of the natural need to hit early adopters at the beginning who have more pain, so will pay you more for it. And like you say, I think pretty much every technological innovation has had that, whether it's Uber with the black cars at the beginning or iPhones, and then now everybody has an iPhone and a smartphone. So yes, I strong agree. So I guess the thing that I think would be interesting to go from here is, so venture capital has traditionally scaled through software. That has been what we've been doing thus far. I think when people talk about like crypto and how crypto, Naval says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That wasn't actually Naval first, but
Mark Twain said that.
Exactly.
That might be disputed too.
It is also disputed. I don't think it's clear that has it been clearly attributed to him? There's a lot of things that have been attributed to Mark Twain, aka Samuel.
He has enough as it is. Anyway, in any case, from that perspective, when people talk about it rhyming with the internet but not being equal to, I feel like one of the biggest differences is that we're building it on top of the internet already with all those protocols already in place. And so one thing that you'll see within crypto is the memes, the spreading of the memes. This is not only crypto, but crypto has a special connection to it because memes can be tied to money then in various ways. So let's talk about some memes. The first one I'd like to talk about is Biddle or Buildle as a meme, which has been pushed by the Ethereum community and to say, hey, we want to move away from HODL as a thing. Let's actually build things for the world. Tell me how you guys are thinking about something like Biddle and how it came to your how it came to your mind and what you think of that as a meme.
I mean, I'll be frank, even going back to Coinbase, we saw Bitcoin very early. I only put a very small amount just to use the product of Coinbase, actually. And I was not a believer in store of value broadly. Like I, thought, hey, maybe that's a gold bug thing. I'm not sure if that's really going to take off. And I was frankly just wrong. But the thing that I think we were right about is that the store of value is not the only piece of it. The really big vision is actually if we can take this very powerful idea of open source and then merge it with money so that we can actually create all kinds of software that frankly could very much challenge the sort of centralized establishment of every type of marketplace, every exchange of value between two people where there's some sort of escrow, some sort of the real difficulty or frontier of this is actually, can you do it at the level of customer support? Like you need a human being intermediary who's sort of refereeing the transaction, for instance. And if it can, well, every sort of transaction between two people or two entities could actually happen better, cheaper, faster, ideally. Just imagine Craigslist has such incredible liquidity. It's impossible to beat them on so many levels, purely because it's free. It's hard to beat that. And so if that could help you create these marketplaces for virtually every human activity, well, that's sort of the big, hairy, audacious goal of what these decentralized systems could be. And the funny thing is that's, we don't know. It might still actually be brought about by Delaware C Corps that we fund.
And how do you see, so I agree with that, and we'll come back to the quote unquote, the tension or the competition with GAFA and traditional centralized aggregators or whatever. How do you think about like BUIDL itself as a meme? Like, when you see stuff on Twitter and crypto Twitter, like what is,
It's a rallying cry. The memes are really interesting in that the culture of crypto broadly has grown very, very quickly, probably in the course of, literally months. It's changing every month. And so the memes, they're incredibly important just as a matter of being sort of the banner or rallying cry around this. It's basically let's be frank, crypto is
a decentralized.
Let's be frank, crypto is a cult, right? We believe things that nobody else believes yet, right? And so BUIDL, I think, is actually, it's a reaction to sort of the more scammy parts of crypto. It's that you can raise an infinite amount of money and never ship something, or say that an alpha is coming next month, and you know what? They're nowhere to be seen in front of a computer. They're not building code, and frankly, it's a shade of what we're used to, and we've seen that a lot in venture capital. Overcapitalized teams with all-star resumes, they raise all this money, and then months later, years later, actually, no product, no shipping.
Anxiety.
What's that?
Performance anxiety.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes.
Right. And so, our culture, coming from Y Combinator, coming from all the startups we funded from literally, one or two people starting out, that culture is ship something and then iterate in front of users. And so this is the perfect meme that merges what we know from building lots and lots of companies with crypto. And so it's the most important meme that frankly could actually deliver all of the things that people have been promising for years.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what kinds of structures, in your conversations with other folks that you've interviewed for this podcast, what kinds of organizational structures and contract structures do you think will emerge that better holds, teams accountable to themselves and their own goals? And then I'm just curious what you're seeing.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess I am being interviewed now. So I think that lots of people are actively trying to bake these kinds of milestones into their ICOs and say, hey, we will only get both vesting contracts, and only when it goes live do we get this amount, only when we have this amount of users does it get this amount. So people are definitely baking those ideas in, and I think that is essentially just a formalization or an institutionalization of the BUIDL mindset, which is anybody who has integrity is going to say, yes, I'm going to raise some money and actually do something with it. And now we're actually trying to move that into contracts of smart and non-smart varieties.
Yeah.
So that's hopefully what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
But there's lots of people that don't do that too.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that we will probably see over the next few months or years, especially around this meme, is actually, frankly, shame. I mean, this is something that I noticed actually at our Burning Man camp. One of the funniest things about it, one of my really close friends runs the camp, and the funniest thing that I noticed watching him run the camp, because you don't manage anyone. All you can really do is try to set up the structure that makes people do things for the good of everyone.
Yep.
And the funniest thing that I saw was he would just be merciless about, really in a funny way, making fun of people for not doing the thing that they're supposed to do. But I think that might end up being really, really valuable for the community broadly, because frankly, the ink's already dry. The crypto's been already transferred, and then after the fact, probably the only thing that will really make people change their behavior is actually the social implication of it, right? Like you show up at a party and it's like, hey, where's that beta? What's going on? And so that's the relationship between this very powerful idea and this powerful meme to the society itself. Hopefully,
I think that has worked somewhat well in a very physically proximate environment like the Bay Area, where you actually physically see people and you expect to work with someone over potentially many companies or years
people
or
might
decades.
just disappear.
But in this world, these teams are all over the world, they're everywhere, so maybe it's probably harder from a social stigma perspective.
Only on crypto Twitter, only around the water cooler can you get the. I agree, it's harder. But hopefully,
that's the hashtag.
Exactly. This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the world's leading trustless digital asset exchange. Quickly swap between dozens of cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Ether, Dash, Bitcoin Cash, Augur, Golem, and many more. And this is not your typical crypto exchange. You don't need to create an account or share your personal information, and your funds are never stored on Shapeshift. This means that your hard-earned digital wealth is never up for grabs by hackers or other malicious actors. To get started, visit Shapeshift.io, choose the tokens you'd like to swap, input your receiving address, and send your funds. It's that easy. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think we'll see what happens with when I think about this is all connected to reputation in various ways, where it's like, look, capital is not the scarce thing anymore. And so when capital's not scarce, what becomes scarce? And it's things like trust and reputation. It's like, look, you might have a lot of money, but if you haven't shipped, you don't get to come to the party or whatever. So that might be true.
Drive your Lambo, but you're not going to be someone I really want to hang out with anymore.
Exactly. So we'll see how that progresses. The other thing that's related to this is from kind of a YC perspective and a lean, agile iteration perspective. You have the build things, but build has a little bit of another key part of the YC perspective is you got to be talking with your customers and understand them and empathize with them. Do you feel like there should be a meme, like an empathy meme or something,
Yeah.
The contemporary social network environment is not conducive to empathy memes at the moment.
Oh my lord. That is the quote of the podcast.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point.
Let's stay on that for a second, because that was the thing I was going to transition, because Garry was talking about it before as well, which is this connection to Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and Netflix, and what have you, and kind of behavioral psychology, hooked culture, addiction culture, when your metrics are based around needing to get more time from people on the platform, and then extracting their data, there's going to be, that has lots of resulting effects. So do you all, this is kind of a question about how bullish are you on crypto question. Do you think crypto and attention economy things placed into crypto could maybe help us make systems so that empathy memes could exist on the internet?
I just think that technology is a general reflection of humanity. I mean, there's no, I don't know if it just reflects who we are, and so it reflects our capacity for both good and bad. So I wouldn't pretend to say that, like, I think that, like, some crypto, some decentralized version of a social network is going to be better than a centralized social. It'll be different. And I think the benefit of it is actually just having, like, I strongly believe in having a balance of power.
Yeah.
And that a balance of power is necessary in an open society and in a democracy. And to the extent that something like that would take off and create a balance of power against centralized entities, I think that in principle is a good thing. I don't know if another version of it is necessarily more optimal. It depends on the incentives built into the structure. It's possible, like, I think certainly in certain categories, like Netflix, for example, versus the Facebooks of the world, like when you're paying for content, you're probably likely to get higher quality. Like, that's the fact that someone's willing to pay for it is symbolic of what they value, and then also sustains higher quality. So that's possible.
Yeah, I think that in what you're talking about is what we call on this show, like, co-evolution towards shared outcomes, which is you need to have, if you're in any system, in any kind of institution, you want to be able to express voice within that system, to have decentralized governance and decentralized ownership, and you want to be able to exit that system if possible.
Yeah, and Facebook, you can't really exit that system.
No
it's it's
you can leave it briefly.
I mean, you can delete your account. I mean, it's effectively a utility. And so what they're doing right now, I mean, up until, I'm very interested to see what the congressional testimony from Mark Zuckerberg will be next week. So he's testifying finally. But, like, up until now, I mean, it's just been a lot of, performative theater of accountability and, like, conversation about creating an artifice or a theater of some type of governance structure, which is not real. And can't be real unless there's, like, a genuine fear of loss of control or power.
Yep. Genuine fear or genuine desire for good, I hope, might be the other end.
Desire is
not good enough. Yeah. That's probably true.
Well, history rhymes, right? So, but how is that different from Hearst, for instance? I mean, these mediums are incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
So,
or, like, I mean, when Joseph Pulitzer, who came to the U.S. as an immigrant, who created a newspaper empire that, enabled the U.S. to end up in the Spanish-American War through yellow journalism, then subsequently, created the Pulitzer Prize and funded Columbia Journalism School as a professionalized institution dedicated towards truth. One could argue that was in, feeling of responsibility for what had happened prior in his, like, private sector career. So.
Yeah, I mean, media has always been incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
So we're just relearning that.
And who is Hearst, by the way?
William Randolph Hearst.
Who's that?
Newspaper editor, not an editor, publisher, like, of the Hearst Castle.
I know nothing. Hearst.
Hear.
Okay. Well, and so why?
And then famously, one of the heirs was kidnapped in the late 70s from San Francisco by the Symbionese Liberation Front.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh. And Hearst was a person who was in old media that then became good? Is that what happened?
No, I mean, you should, what is I'm spacing on the movie.
Citizen Kane.
Oh,
yes.
God. Things from pop culture that I should know.
Yes. Citizen Kane is one of the classics for sure.
Yeah. Like the classic. Right. There's, like, Casablanca and there's Citizen Kane.
And, the person representing Hearst in Citizen Kane is very much a tragic figure.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that all. I mean, do you back to the bullish, skeptical perspective towards crypto? If you guys were to predict 5 years from the future, or in amount of years from the future, do you see blockchain-based bottom-up organizational structures and incentive structures beating things like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and what have you? Or how do you see those two evolving?
Two things. One is Buildle.
Yeah.
And then the second part is Schipple.
Let's do Schipple.
That's right. Schipple is next. But really beyond that, it really comes back to user experience. And so, that's where the empathy comes in. You literally have to have enough empathy for your users to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's never done this before. And that was one of the most important things for founders making something from scratch is what is it like for someone who is not you, has never seen this before, who has totally different aims and goals, what do they want out of this? Is this something that they actually want? Can you get them to click on the right thing so that they can accomplish the thing that they want?
Yep.
And that's where empathy really plays. And so part of the difficulty is the tech is so new, the protocols are so new, the user experience is not there.
Yep.
But it will be, and that's why we talk about crypto being in the 1994 moment, right? Like in 1994, very few people actually even had internet access. NCSA Mosaic was brand new. Netscape had just been formed. Mark Andreessen invented the image tag around that time. So we're so early that the image tag is being designed right now, and that's pretty exciting times.
It
actually.
is fun, yeah. Do you think that?
I mean, I think a good, case to aim for is the balance of power case, where you have a lot of options, and you can choose to, participate in a network with either a centralized actor, or you have the optionality of having like a competitive, decentralized option. That has a lot of your acquaintances or contacts on it.
Yep, that might actually work in some ways. Yeah, that's the goal. So one final follow-up question on this, and then we'll transition to our final topic. Do you think if HODL and BIDL were the memes for now, what would you guys think? And this might be a hard pattern match, but I'm not sure. What do you think would be the memes for like 1994 early internet? Like what was the rallying cry around that time?
I don't remember what they mean. I mean,
memes didn't exist because it cost money still to move information.
Field of Dreams, I don't know.
It was in 1994. I was like, we were both like teenage. We were both very.
But I remember going to the high school and like stringing Cat 5 wire because that was the first time the high school had A, computer, and B, internet access that was provided for free by some
ASL
nonprofit.
Meme.
Right. That's right.
Not a bad one, 3 letters. Yeah, that's what I feel. Yeah, I'm not sure. I watched a video of Mark Andreessen talking in 1993, 1994 recently about internet as a virus and things like that, and it felt very similar to crypto, but I don't know.
They said information superhighway, the global village.
That's global village is from the 70s. That's like, isn't that a McLuhan reference?
Maybe, yeah.
The
medium is the message after all.
Yeah.
The medium is the message. So transitioning so we've talked about decentralization from kind of a tech platform perspective. Let's talk about decentralization from a geographic perspective. So we are currently in San Francisco. There are various people that post on the internet that say like, oh my God, San Francisco, it's like going away in various ways, and like power is going to other places. For me personally, being from Denver, it's like, no, like still a bunch of the sweet people that I follow on Twitter are in San Francisco. How are you feeling currently about San Francisco as a place, and especially in the context of something like crypto?
I'm going to answer this. The way that I describe the Bay Area right now, it's an overflowing cup, right? So filled the cup to the brim, and now it's just like spilling over.
Yeah, BART is barely usable
over to the rest of the country. And I don't think the things that concern me from a long-term perspective here is that like a lot of the the suburban communities that were the original kind of founding,
like where we grew up, Fremont and Cupertino.
The original founding spaces that were central to the creation of Silicon Valley, like they're rapidly aging out. So like the median age in Palo Alto in 1970, with the dawn of the semiconductor industry, was around 29 or 30. So it's like actually a really young place. And today it's like well into the late 40s, and Palo Alto is rapidly aging out. And there's nothing wrong with like, we want to have multi-generational communities, but the problem is they're not enabling the inherent population growth that's already happening, and they're not, creating infrastructure and capacity such that the Bay Area can be or play the role that it was playing like 20, 30 years ago when, middle class or working class immigrants, like my mom's side of the family were refugees who came here in the 80s. could come here and participate and then experience that upward social mobility.
All of my high school
And so
friends who are
now-
not in tech have left the Bay Area,
Yeah.
and then now all of my tech friends, half of them are plotting their exits to Denver, to Austin, to Seattle, to Portland, to New York.
Yeah, so people are spilling out, and what this does is it does a couple things to the culture of the Bay Area and the culture of the industry. One is like, okay, we're fighting to keep the people that have made the Bay Area awesome, right? Like, we don't want people to be displaced, but we're also creating the set of conditions where the only people who can come here are effectively very wealthy people. And so that just changes the range of ideas and perspectives that can be part of the mixing pot here. I think it's like very good for, good is complicated. It's, good for economic performance and innovation of other major metros, both in the United States and abroad. It may not necessarily be good for like tenants in some of those communities because they're getting our overflow. So, I hope my consistent, repeated worry about the Bay Area is that, we just become a locked out place where you can only come here if you're very wealthy or if you like live in your parents' home or something like that.
And the reality is, even just for within the tech community, there are real effects in that. One thing that we know happens in the past is, there will be companies, like there's so much magic that happens here in sort of the random chance encounters between people that it actually enables these companies to actually exist and thrive. And at the same time, we've seen companies leave, and things that might have worked had they stayed here, they just don't work because they don't have the communities, they don't have the set of values to sort of really sustain them.
It's also the talent pool. Like they don't have people that they can hire. Obviously they can hire and train people in, but there's just like a thicker, engineered talent pool here that there's more likely to find some a one-to-one match or what you're looking for.
The upshot is, if San Francisco, basically it's an overflowing cup, then on the tech side, there are actually companies that could have succeeded here that are failing elsewhere. And that won't be forever, and that's not zero sum. It just means it'll happen later.
But we're fine. Personally, a lot of people are always like, why don't you guys invest in more companies outside? And I'm like, we like traveling. We'll travel. We'll go wherever.
1/3 of our portfolio is fully outside of this.
That's not the constraining factor. I'm just saying that if this region doesn't make the long-term investments that it needs to make in capacity and infrastructure, like we'll go and invest in lots of other parts of the world, or like the U.S. and Canada, but it doesn't mean that the situation is significantly better here for middle-class people unless there are significant changes in the governance and infrastructure systems here.
Yeah, so sounds like from the ground floor it is happening. You guys can feel it, and it is. But there's still lots of long-term inertia here, and it's kind of sad that some of that long-term inertia is going away because there's so much spontaneity that can happen. And the root of the issue is that the infrastructure was not keeping pace with the innovation, and so it was lots and lots of stuff was happening, and we didn't build enough big apartment buildings. So cool. Well, that's interesting. We'll see how it plays out in the 10-year timescale in terms of where SF is compared to various other parts of the world.
Don't get me wrong. I'm excited for other parts of the country. Like I always there are lots of great communities and cities in the rest of the U.S. that have nascent ecosystems. And I'm not thinking about just like New York or LA or Seattle. There's a lot of other ones.
Chattanooga, Atlanta. We're
Yep.
seeing great companies come out of all sorts of places.
Yep. Once you, everybody has access to the internet. Everybody can learn. Smart people and hardworking people are grown everywhere.
Thanks to the global village and the information superhighway.
Exactly. Woohoo! Well, with that, thank you again both for being here and for being on the show. It was fun.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if you want to I guess if you are a entrepreneur that is looking to be invested in, I don't know, I think that you guys probably aren't allowed to say these words, but I can say these words. You can go to initializecapital.com.
Initialized.com.
Initialized.com, you know, swing and a miss. Nice try, Reese. You can also follow both Garry and Kim on Twitter. What are your Twitter handles?
I'm Garry Tan, at Garry Tan, GarryTan.
Yeah, and he is Garry Block Chan. Yeah.
Well, that's not his name.
Not his real name. Sorry. Yeah.
Maybe you should do a legal name change though.
Yeah, that would be fun.
And I'm Kim-Mai Cutler. That's KIMMAICUTLER on Twitter.
Woohoo! Thank you all for listening, and if you want to support me, you can support me at patreon.com/RieslandMark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK, and the same on StakeTree if you want to support with ETH. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye. And if you guys ever do an or an then I'm not going to post the episode.
Oh no.
You guys are like,
But there's
is he serious?
like